You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio, and this is Unpuzzling Terror, the podcast that brings you experts from around the world to discuss the world of terror and how it's unfolding on a global level. We've had interviews with the experts in very specific fields. Today, joining us from the master's class is Emma Harris. How are you doing today, Emma?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
And our guest today in studio is Dr. Daphne Richemond-Barak, who came to the IDC in 2009, studied at Yale, studied at Oxford, has been a legal advisor for governments in the international arena, has represented private clients in the international arena. She established and supervises the IDC's participation in the International Committee for the Red Crosses. And of course, most importantly, she is a professor here at the IDC. Dr. Barak, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We'll get right down to it. Something that has come up in your courses, something that has come up in the world of terror as a whole, and championed by Dr. Boaz Ganor, is the definition of terrorism. And I wanted to get your take on the fact that there isn't an established definition of terrorism and how that affects the legal arena when combating terrorism.
So that's a great and good question, and also a long-lasting one. And I believe there's a committee actually at the United Nations that has been working on this for a very long time. This is really, we do not have a definition of terrorism, or at least one consistent one across the board, one that would apply in time of peace and that would apply in time of war. I think that to some extent, and at the risk of disagreeing with my mentor and someone I dearly admire, Professor Boaz Ganor, I think to some extent the legal arena has succeeded in overcoming the lack of a definition of terrorism, meaning to some extent we do have treaties that are combating the financing of terrorism, and they are quite successful at doing so. We do have distinct acts of terrorism that are regulated by international, like hijacking of airplanes. So to some extent, this difficulty has been overcome. However, sometimes it comes up again in full force, and once again we are hit the wall to some extent. And that, for example, is the case with respect to the regulation of foreign fighters. Again, the United Nations has tried to regulate foreign fighters, restrain their movements and their return to their countries of origin. But because there is no definition of terrorism, I think this regime is not perfect. It's lacking to some extent, and it could be misinterpreted. And that, if you go back to the core of the reason why that is so, it's because we don't have a definition of terrorism. So again, we managed to overcome the challenge, let's say 75% of the time, but sometimes we have 25% of the time where we once again, are back to square one. But I'm not sure that we can actually overcome it for good and, get over the 100%. And for now, we're doing with what we have, which is not as bad as we could expect.
I just wanted to follow up on that. You brought up the foreign fighters, and in 2014, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2178, and it's acting under Chapter 7, and the resolution is mandatory and binding. Do you feel that when foreign fighters go back to their home countries, or does this law even, not necessarily even in your opinion, but does this law allow for them to be tried as terrorists or criminals?
So first of all, about Resolution 2178 that you mentioned, it's a very important resolution. It's part of really the greatest moves that the UN has done in recent years in order to combat terrorism. I think it was very much needed. Again, not foolproof at 100%, partly because of the absence of a definition, but many restraints, many constraints, many actions that are demanded, required of states to make in order to combat this. Now, does that answer all the questions? Definitely not. And with respect to whether states are going to try them as terrorists or criminals, that is something that is actually left to states to decide under the domestic legal system. So they will have to decide whether or not they have a specific offense of terrorism or whether this falls within a criminal. But I think what the UN wants is for them to be actually, first of all, stopped to the extent as possible in their travels and movements, and also actually prosecuted. So under whatever, head or category as the state sees fit. I think that would be difficult for the UN to really decide ahead of time.
Okay. And jumping off of our discussion, of course, about definitions and states making some of their own decisions, in your new article about is money a legitimate target, you've discussed how basically recently, as January of this year, the U.S. has begun targeting money. Could you speak a bit more about your article?
Yeah, so that was that was actually an event that was surprisingly not reported very much, where the United States targeted what it called a cash depot of ISIS, and proudly posted that the only thing that we really had was this video that was, I think it was posted on CNN on an exclusive basis, showing all the dollars blowing in the air as, right after the strike of that cash depot, whatever it really was. So I think, first of all, it would have been helpful to know what exactly we're talking about. Was it like the equivalent of the Treasury Department of ISIS, which exists, or was it really just a cash depot or a bank? Or I mean, whatever it was, it would have helped in order to conduct the analysis. But what was surprising from my point of view was that got very little attention. So one of my first objective was actually to bring it up, to kind of like put a focus on it, and then to think about what it meant in legal ways and whether we felt entirely comfortable with cash being a legitimate target. Because if cash is a legitimate target, what it means under the law is that it could potentially justify the injury or the death of innocent civilians. And that's where I wanted to raise the question: are we 100% comfortable with the fact that when we target money, we're willing to pay the price of losing innocent civilians? Of course, the innocent civilians, if they were targeted intentionally, they would not be a legitimate target. But if the money is a legitimate target, then under the proportionality calculus, then the innocent civilians could be killed, and that would be lawful, depending on how much money you have and all sorts of other conditions and criteria. So that was really my question. Are we okay with that? And the other question that I thought was worth reflecting upon was, what does that mean about the U.S. Treasury, right? What does that mean about other types of money, state money? So then, the other question that comes to mind is, okay, so is that money destined to finance military operations? And what if it finances both, social services and military operations? And how do we make that call? And if that's the case, then maybe the U.S. Treasury really is a legitimate target as well. So it was kind of a provocative piece. I definitely would grant you that.
Well, it was great because you also bring up, of course, something that's on a lot of people's minds, ISIS, and the fact that ISIS acts not only, they don't just carry out military attacks, they also govern a distinct area. So funding for ISIS would, in fact, be used as well for civilian purposes. So where does that leave us in terms of, the U.S. at least making legal decisions based on targeting that money? Where do you think that would leave us with regards to ISIS?
So that was precisely what was disturbing to me, I think, and I think I did say that in the piece, in the sense that if it were your run-of-the-mill terrorist organization, a small group with a local presence, but, there still is a state in the background, just the state is not succeeding in limiting, the actions of that terrorist group, then maybe that would have been different. But given what we know about ISIS, and given the governance capability, and given that, numbers, hundreds of thousands of civilians are under the authority of ISIS, and it's, for me, from my point of view, looking very much like a state, even though I know that is also controversial. Given those specific characteristics of ISIS, that's what actually bothered me. And I think, where does it leave us in terms of I think it's like sometimes we don't think of our action as having as first of all having a double-edged sword. It's kind of like a two-way street. And I'm not saying, and I think it's important to say, I'm not saying it's something illegal to do. I'm saying, let's just think about it for a minute and then reflect. And it was a blog piece. It was not like a full-fledged article, in which case I would have definitely offered a more, some kind of theory to say whether or not. But in this case, I just wanted to flag something and say, okay, let's think about it. What does that mean for future operations? What does that mean for the financing, also for the financing of terrorism, because the financing of terrorism until now was left to kind of like law enforcement issues, banking, financial regulation. Suddenly we want to stop the financing of terror by targeting it. For me, that was a complete shift from what we've had seen so far. So it was more like signaling a shift than anything else.
Yeah, you said that the January 10th date was really like marked the shift. So are you thinking that we're seeing the start of potential trends in how we deal with things, or do you think it's been, have there been other instances before that come to mind for you where money has been an issue in terms of targeting?
So look, it's not the first time that the U.S. holds this view. The U.S. has held the view for a long time that what they call war-sustaining activities can actually be legitimate targets. And other states have kind of like resisted that view. So the U.S. has always been a little bit more, I would say, more large in its interpretation of what is a legitimate target from that really narrow point of view, not in general, but that just on that point. So the question is that part of what the U.S. views as a war-sustaining activity, and then therefore it would fit within their more general view, which is not such a revolution, or whether it's really a shift, and then other states are also likely to adopt it, which is what happens in international law. One state throws a ball, and other states either, send it back or keep it or, play the same game. So the question is that going to stick or not?
So something you brought up in your article and now in your answers has just got a flood of questions going on in my head. And I wanted to sort of just pose it this way. To begin with, in your article, you said that, does that make taxpayers complicit in the state funding? And so I wanted to bring that up to you, is how far removed from the actual organization do you have to be considered a combatant? Which brings me then to the question of a combatant in Article 51, and how do you define a combatant? And I know from being in one of your courses, you explained about giving the scenario that by day the father is sitting at home with his children. He is cooking, he's cleaning, he goes to work, he picks them up from school, daycare, and then at night he goes and is a logistics expert for the terrorist organization. At what point is he a combatant? At what point is he not? And so it just carries over with the taxpayer question that I had for you. And lastly, you brought up the U.S. is looking at different war-sustaining efforts. And we've seen in World War II where specifically oil depots, train tracks, all of that was targeted by all the countries. And then we also saw in Vietnam, that was also a tactic of the United States to go after these specific, what would be normally considered civilian targets, but turned into military targets. Where does international law come into play on these issues?
Okay, so triple question.
Yeah.
Okay, so about, I hope I remember all of them. So about the status, first of all, that individual who's at home with his family at night and he's, either planning a terrorist attack or, thinking about a terrorist attack, logistically planning or planning the bomb, making the bomb, organizing the details, what is his or her status? International law, the consensus right now is not to actually regard them as combatant if they are part of a terrorist organization, but rather to discuss, they're regarded as civilians actually, which could seem, which I've had a problem with that interpretation for a long time, but that nevertheless remains the consensus. They are regarded as civilians who may from time to time take what is called a direct part in hostilities according to this Article 51.3 that you mentioned of Additional Protocol 1, which is an important treaty when it comes to the laws of war. So the question is the activity that person is doing at that given time sufficient to bring them across the board, basically to go over that threshold of direct participation in hostilities, which would turn them into a legitimate target at that moment. And so that's really the question with respect to the status. Now, the other question, so the United States had this practice of in Vietnam, and also we saw this in World War II as well, as you mentioned. I think international has evolved since then. I think international tried to limit that kind of like targeting, which is too far remote from what is directly related to the war effort. And the taxpayer is actually used as the embodiment of that doctrine, in the sense that we are not going to punish the taxpayers because they are paying taxes to a government whose policies we don't like, because it's not their fault. They are innocent and they are non-combatant and they are protected under international law. So that is actually, sometimes in international you have no black and no white, but here it's black and white. Taxpayers are not legitimate targets. And the question is then what happens to these other kind of like less categorical situations, which are the oil depots and some other examples that you gave. I think international has tried to limit that, and again, here we see differences in interpretations by states. But but I think the idea that it's cash itself, it's not even the oil, it's not even, here it was really the dollars. It was actual dollars that were targeted. assuming that's what the U.S. targeted. I just don't know what they actually targeted and what was their rationale. I wish I knew. And in fact, if they hear me, maybe they can send us some information. But that would be very helpful in actually analyzing this further, which right now we're kind of missing some of the pieces of the puzzle.
Okay. Something else that's really interested me about the research that you do, and I know you have a book coming out on it, is tunnel warfare, which of course has a lot of, I guess maybe some legal gray areas. And something that I found interesting on reading some writings you've done already on it are the fact that, like, looking at Operation Protective Edge, for example. So the UN wrote an assessment of that. But they failed to address some really fundamental things. So what in your mind are some major issues that they failed to address?
So I have been writing a book, and I'm in the finishing stages of a book on underground warfare, which is actually the first book which is going to be ever written on this question.
Congratulations.
Even though some people are now starting to pick up on the topic, but what's interesting about underground warfare is that it's not just from the legal standpoint, but also historically and from the view, the perspective of even military strategy, military theory. There's just nothing that's been written on it. Only like on distinct conflicts, you would find something on World War I, something on Vietnam, which Itai mentioned, but it's not. You don't have something horizontal that would look at it, as kind of a feature of war. So that's really what I've been doing. And in terms of one of my criticism about the UN report on Operation Protective Edge is that they did discuss many of the actions that Israel took and many of the strikes that were carried out and all that. And so they would discuss it, according to a legal analysis of the situation, which you can agree with or disagree with. Right now, it's not the issue. But the part that was really shocking to me was that it was almost like the tunnel aspect of it, the underground aspect of it was an afterthought. It was like, oh, and by the way, there were tunnels in the neighborhood, but okay, let's conduct our analysis as we usually do. And one of the major points I want to make in this book, and I'm making in the book, is that when we are dealing with underground warfare, when there is an element of underground warfare in an armed conflict, it basically changes everything. So it changes the dynamic between the two belligerents or more. It changes the type of tactics that you can use. There's someone who said it to me, someone from the IDF who said to me, instead of waging war ahead of you, you have to wage war 360 degrees because someone can come from the back. So you think you've covered the rear, but really somebody can come from the back and surprise you. So it's a totally different way of waging war. You're limited in the terms of your communication tools because the underground, of course, we have no reception, no strategy. Some of the GPS tools cannot be used underground. The rescue of your wounded soldiers, the type of psychological training you need to give the soldiers in order to deal with the underground. I mean, the list goes on. I'm not going to bore you with the whole list, but basically even if you don't agree that it changes everything, it certainly changes some aspects, and legally it also changes some aspects. So what I criticized about the UN report was that it kind of like, probably for lack of knowledge. I'm not sure it's on purpose, right? It's not voluntarily, but it's not understanding the impact that underground warfare has on conflict, on the capabilities, on even knowing the extent of your enemy's destructive capabilities. Like one of the things that Israel couldn't find out, for example, is how many rockets Hamas really had. Well, why not? Because those rockets were kept underground. And so Israel miscalculated or misassessed the amount of rockets that Hamas possessed. So that's because it was because of the underground aspect. There's a lot of what I called an unknown factor that permeates all of warfare when it comes to this underground element. So that's something that I thought that should have been, at least the effort should have been made to understand it better.
One thing that I find very interesting specifically about the Gaza underground warfare situation right now is the fact that it is destabilizing the actual ground above Gaza. And so what we are seeing are tunnel collapses, which eventually can lead to more destructive things. And then on the legal end, I wanted to ask you, what we see Egypt doing to combat these tunnels is flooding them with with water from the Mediterranean Sea.
And also sewage water.
And sewage water. And so from a legal standpoint, you know that they are combating it from a terrorist perspective. That is their objective, but they are really injuring the civilian population in and around there. There is mad flooding. There is immense amounts of property destruction. Even on the Egyptian side, they evacuated nearly, quite a few thousand people from their own border to be able to go about this. This is brand new to the world. So how does the legal arena look at this when they see that they are just trying to combat terrorism, but at the same time, it is such an outlandish maneuver right now that it is having ecological damage as well as property damage for the residents of Gaza that isn't necessarily Hamas?
Yeah, no, that's excellent, and I think you summarized it very well. One of the unique feature of cross-border underground warfare, which is basically what is going on here between Gaza and Israel. It's not always cross-border, but in this case, it's cross-border. One of the unique features I believe this warfare presents is that it actually threatens civilians on both sides of the conflict. So the usual view is to say, okay, Israeli civilians are threatened by the cross-border tunnels. The cross-border tunnels are meant to hurt them, and there's a huge psychological impact of knowing that tunnels are being dug near your home and so on. So I'm not saying this is uncontested, but that's the traditional view, and I think people could relate to that. The other side of the coin, however, is that the Palestinians' lives are being put in danger by these tunnels, and that's something which is when you think about a tool of war that puts in danger both sides of the civilians on both sides of the conflict, that's quite unique. So that's a major aspect, and that's because why does it threaten them? What does it actually pose a risk to these civilians as well, the Palestinian side? Is because these tunnels are dug under their homes, under their civilian infrastructure, because there are collapses all the time, because there's also movements of explosives underground. So, one wrong step, one wrong move, and the house above can explode. And so that's really a huge risk. And in fact, in rare interviews that were conducted of Palestinians with respect to the tunnel threat, they are petrified. They say, we know what we are. We know that the tunnels threaten us because of what's going on underground, and we know that also if Israel wants to get to these tunnels, our houses will have to be destroyed. So, and lives will have to be lost. So I think there's great consciousness. It looks like there's consciousness of what this threat actually includes, and it's very concerning. Now, with respect to Egypt. Egypt has had like a zero tolerance policy vis-a-vis these tunnels between, and this time, Egypt and Gaza. But the practices that they've employed, like flooding the tunnels, using sewage water, evacuating without notice, almost without notice and without compensation, like you said, the population at the border. It's very interesting. And you said, so it's new, like what is the world saying about this? So I'll give you one great example, which I found mind-blowing. There's a report entitled Looking for Another Home. I believe it's Human Rights Watch. Could be Amnesty International, but I believe it's Human Rights Watch, in which they actually analyze the situation of Egypt dealing with the tunnel and what it does to the population. And when you read it, you realize they don't know how to analyze it. So Human Rights Watch, assuming it's Human Rights Watch, is completely lost. It's trying to analyze this under human rights law, trying to analyze this under humanitarian law, which is the laws of war, knows that something is wrong. So he's saying there's probably violations that are committed of international law, but just it's not clear what exactly is being violated and by what actions. And when I read that, it really was to me, it's like the writing on the wall. No one knows what are the rules that govern this type of actions, what can be done against a tunnel. Is it a problem vis-a-vis human rights law or vis-a-vis the laws of war, or both potentially, but really total lack of clarity.
Oh, what? Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to... Something that comes to mind for me is also in discussing, so the way Egypt deals with it versus Israel. Israel also has a unique dilemma with the tunnels in that I actually went on a trip down to the Gaza Egyptian-Israeli border. Oh, nice. And we had a great IDF guide who showed us all the trucks that go in every day. They said on average maybe 150 trucks. So that's Israel supplying a lot of things, including cement, especially after the destruction to buildings and Operation Protective Edge. Israel was supplying cement to Gaza. And what I understood from a spokesperson from the IDF was that a lot of that cement is then used, so it's at the expense of the Gazan people and civilians. It's used to build these tunnels. And it's an interesting dilemma, I guess, because you've got the humanitarian issues, but then you've also got the military threat.
you do.
So and there's nothing legal surrounding it. What's Israel? Is Israel doing anything as to change the status quo?
So Israel could either stop supplying cement or continue, knowing that whatever proportion, and I don't know the exact number, but I don't think anyone knows, but I would assume a great proportion of that cement ends up, because the Palestinians, they're building very sophisticated tunnels that are there's cement all over them. So not all tunnels are like that, but these are the types of so we know they're using the cement for that. But if there's a chance that this cement is also going to be used to build homes, I think this dilemma is huge, and I think we have this dilemma with a lot of other types of goods that are going to the Palestinians. And I think the answer is in oversight and is in monitoring. And I don't think the answer would be, stop sending the cement. We have other tools maybe against the tunnels that are more efficient than just stopping the cement. So here, my humanitarian side says, okay, let's continue doing that. Let's find other ways to monitor what goes on with that cement afterwards, or to combat the tunnel threat some other way, because they do need the cement for humanitarian purposes as well.
One of the questions that have come up in the international arena vis-a-vis Israel and the Operation Protective Edge was the use of Hannibal, which is a military tactic when a soldier goes missing or is kidnapped. And again, this was used specifically when a soldier went missing in one of the tunnels and another 2 went after him. And all 3 soldiers sadly passed away. But Israel employed Operation Hannibal, which indiscriminately has massive amounts of artillery fire. And this was in a very dense populated area. What is the legality of that situation when you are there, A, trying to protect your own soldiers, B, you are fighting in an urban, dense population and in a center of a town almost, and then 3, the enemy is coming up from underground in a tunnel where you are now needing to or chase after them or blow up the tunnel. I think Israel's been given undue scrutiny on specifically this specific issue. What is your opinion on the world scrutiny of that specific incident?
Look, the world scrutiny is all over what Israel does, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, so long as there are no double standards, which unfortunately sometimes there are. But the specific attention that this issue received is, I don't know if it's unjustified. It's very hard for me to say, and I'll tell you why. We know very little, the public. I'm not an IDF official. And I know very little about this Hannibal doctrine. And I don't know the conditions in which it is triggered. I don't know exactly what it entails. What I know is what I hear mostly from these scrutinizing views, which are quite critical. I think if I were, however, in the IDF, what I would recommend is that there would be some kind of internal committee that would sit and would look at what exactly, do we really have criteria? Because I don't know. Do we really have criteria governing the triggering of this doctrine and what this doctrine entails? And do we, so kind of like at the meta level, right? That's what I would like to see going on. And maybe it is going on. I just don't know. But I would like to have within the IDF, a group, a small committee that is reviewing this doctrine. When does it apply? When does it not apply? Is it indiscriminate or not? If it is, it's got to be revised. What can be released about this doctrine to the public so we know more, and to avoid further unjustified scrutiny if possible. But again, I think there's here a huge element of security interest and national security. Not many states release this information. I'm not saying that Israel should release all of it. These things very often remain secret, and for good reason sometimes. But I would like to know that something like this is going on, some kind of brainstorming and some kind of thinking about whether this doctrine fits within the framework of international law.
We have time for just a couple more questions, so let Emma ask hers and I'll ask mine.
Yeah, so in the interests of maybe stopping or dealing with the tunnels before you get to something like an Operation Hannibal, which would have a lot of impact on civilians, I know that it's come out in the news that in the last year, Israel has said they've made some really exciting breakthroughs in ways to sort of detect the tunnels. And I believe it was using some degree of being able to detect minor seismic activity within the tunnels. And of course, we don't know a ton yet about what the exact methods are, but they seemed very excited. Can you speak at all a little about that, or how you see a breakthrough like that really shifting the playing field if, hopefully not, but in the instance where another operation like Operation Protective Edge comes into play?
So I do think there's something is going on the technological side of things. However, it's important to note that in terms of tunnels and tunnel detection, tunnel destruction, mapping tunnels, technology alone cannot solve the problem. And I think anyone who understands the underground will agree with that. It's a combination of extremely good intelligence, hard to gather, particularly in this situation because it's underground and you don't know what's going on. So, but this human intelligence, visual intelligence, analyzing the geography, the topography. So do we suddenly see hangars coming up and disappearing, or do we see a lot of soil being moved around and trucks? Then we know that tunnels are being dug. So it's not just a technology, it's a lot of other skills that need to be applied in tandem. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to overcome the threat. So, but I think Israel on the technology part of thing is definitely improving, or at least investing effort and resources in that field. I have no information about what it is exactly that they're doing, but my sense is that we can't expect. Some people talk about the Iron Dome of the underground. I don't believe that this is like the right approach. I don't think we can have foolproof on the underground solution right now. It's a lot more complicated than that. So that's with respect to the threat and how to deal with it. And I'm sorry, you asked me something else, and I forgot the second part of the question.
Oh, no, I was just wondering if you see that really making a difference.
Oh, and I wanted to mention something else. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So the latest thing that Israel has been talking about, and I remember what I want to say, is an underground wall. Right. Yeah. So I'm actually very much skeptical of that. Egypt actually tried that. It didn't work out. I don't believe that's the right approach because the tunnels are being dug deeper and deeper. What we see in the latest tunnels that have been dug is that they are deeper than the ones we saw in Protective Edge. So underground wall, up to what depth, is it really, can you really not dig through it?
How deep are we talking? Like when you say they're getting deeper and deeper?
We're talking like 30 meters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't believe that. I think they make it more difficult and more cumbersome to dig, but they don't stop the tunnel threat. So that's the latest. That's the latest measure that's been announced. So that's why I wanted to talk about it.
And before we wrap up, something that's always on the mind of Israelis all the time is the threats of being taken to the ICC. And we have seen over the last couple of years in the change in the prosecution there at the ICC, a little more warmth or understanding towards the Israeli side that we haven't necessarily seen in the past. Now, one thing that I would like to make clear, and hopefully you can clear this up for everyone, is the fact that the ability for the ICC to intervene must be on a basis that the fact that the Israeli justice system, the Supreme Court of Israel, and the court system, the legal system here, is not doing its job, or is not even is not vibrant, is not working according to its standards. One thing we know for sure is that Israel has a very vibrant legal system, and everyone and anyone can almost take anything to the Supreme Court in this country. And so my question is why hasn't anything almost outright been thrown out of the ICC when we know, and they know, that Israel has a vibrant legal system that stands up for human rights, it stands up for the rights of civilians, it stands up for the rights of people that are considered occupied, and so at the same end also has no problem prosecuting its own governmental officials and its military officials. Why isn't that ever being applied towards Israel? And they could say, look, it's out of our hands because Israel's legal system is vibrant and working.
Look, in 2009, after the Cast-led operation, there was the infamous Goldstone report, right? And in the infamous Goldstone report, there was actually a very short assessment of the Israeli legal system, and it was an extremely negative and critical one. One paragraph, I'm not saying that they did a doctorate on this issue. Of course, if they had, probably they would have found something completely different. But knowing exactly what you portrayed here, which is called in international the principle of complementarity, which means that the international criminal system cannot be triggered unless a state is either unwilling or unable to investigate and prosecute, meaning cannot do its job for whatever, doesn't want to do its job, cannot do its job. So that's when the international system kicks in. Now, knowing very well this, the Goldstone report actually criticized the international the Israeli system, because if you criticize it, then you can overcome this complementarity issue, and then you can say, okay, it doesn't matter what Israel is doing, it's imperfect, it's not done in due course, it takes too long, they don't actually ever convict anyone within the military or within the civilian system. So that's very important. So keep it in mind. It's not as clear cut as you might think, and some people might still hold different views. But that you're right in saying that this is really the kind of like the important aspect in having the ICC address something. Now, with respect to the warmth towards Israel, I don't know if I would actually adopt that categorization.
Maybe a thawing of ties, if you will.
I'll tell you what it is. Basically, what happened is that the ICC prosecutor threw out the suit that was brought to it by the Comoros against
in the Mavi Marmara situation.
With regard to the Mavi Marmara situation, exactly. And so the ICC prosecutor said, look, she actually did not address complementarity, which we talked about, but she said it's not it doesn't reach the threshold of gravity that the ICC statute requires, and therefore there's no room for us to intervene and to actually bring this to court. So in that sense, you can say that it was in the direction of what Israel would have wanted, in the sense that the Mavi Marmara incident will not be tried by the ICC. I wouldn't take this too far. I don't think it's big. I think it's more actually probably the great. What we will learn from this is something more with respect to what the meaning of gravity is than with respect to Israel. I don't think that she feels particularly friendly towards Israel. I think, if anything, I think it should make us worry about the next time that something will come upon Israel at the ICC, because she's not going to be warm, twice in a row. I don't think it's about this, though. I think it's about, in that case, really, there was a relatively narrow, small, contained incident, which probably doesn't rise to the level of gravity under the ICC statute. But what's interesting is that she didn't even have to get to the point of saying, okay, what did Israel do to prosecute those involved or to investigate those involved in the Marmara incident?
So would you say that she set a precedent on what gravity of situation is at that point?
Yeah, I think she would. That's probably the case. And look, the other thing that's interesting is that she was heavily criticized by the judges who actually appealed her decision. So it was like an internal war, if you want, within the ICC itself, which is unprecedented, of course, because Israel always creates these new situations. But what's really interesting is that it really led to a lot of tension within, like in terms of the political cost to her. The Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor at the ICC, was huge, because she really held her ground. And they said to her, how can you say this doesn't rise to the gravity threshold? And they said, maybe gravity is not the right test. So anyways, there was a lot of debate internally within the ICC, and she really held strong. So she used a lot of political capital on this. So I wouldn't, be careful on that.
All right, Dr. Daphne Richemond-Barak, thank you so much for joining us here. For anyone that is joining us late, Dr. Daphne Richemond-Barak is the head of the International Law Desk here at the ICT. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we let you go, as Emma mentioned, you are releasing a book right away here. Where could people go get this book, and where can people get your other works and read the other important information that you've provided?
So you can find my work on the IDC, my IDC faculty page. You might be interested on an article actually on the legal and security implication of the Iron Dome, which is another aspect of modern contemporary warfare that is relevant. And the book will be up with Oxford University Press and available, of course, on Amazon and other well-known retailers.
Well, we look forward to the book, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Emma, for coming into the studio. Really appreciate your time. And that is it for Unpuzzling Terror. I'm Itai Hanman. Thank you for listening. And this has been 106.2 FM IDC Radio.